Let's begin tonight with the prayers as usual. So let me put that on the screen. Let's skip over the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha tonight and just go right to the mandala offering prayer. This ground. Oh, you're not seeing it here. Is the problem? No, no, no. That's not going to happen then. We're not going to have slides to share with other than here. Okay. All right, this ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Hidam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And we'll do the refuge in bodhicitta, first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye dupar shok sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye duparsho. Okay, let's do a short meditation. Just give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit by meditating on the breath for a few minutes. And you're welcome to use whatever technique you prefer with the breath. And then I will come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation together. So again, those of you online, just before we start, know that if there's anything you need to say to me or any questions or anything, put them in the... Oh, I can unmute now? Okay. All right, well then, yeah, I will go ahead and put my speaker up. You're still okay? You're not getting an echo or anything there? No? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and do our meditation. A bit of meditation on the breath, and then I'll lead you in setting motivation. In our last class, we did talk a bit about this virtuous mental factor, non-harmfulness, that is the antidote to one of the close afflictions to anger, the mind of harmfulness, the mind that wishes to inflict harm upon others. And non-harmfulness, its antidote, is essentially compassion. Rather than having a mind that wishes to harm other beings, especially those who have harmed ourselves or those that we love, this is a mind that chooses to see them through the lens of compassion, with the understanding that sentient beings are acting, behaving from a deluded mind. They don't know reality. They don't even know causes of happiness, the causes of suffering. And so the actions they engage in are certainly something we can be opposed to, but the beings themselves, we have to have compassion for, because we see that if they had that knowledge, if they were able to work with their minds, they wouldn't be engaging in those actions. So when we generate our motivation, it's rooted in this compassionate mind that's looking at all sentient beings with that understanding. We're all in the same boat in this regard, all dealing with minds that have had delusion since beginningless time. And we can feel fortunate that we have met with the Dharma and these teachings as we're going through in this course to learn how to know our minds, to work with our minds. But most sentient beings don't even have that knowledge. So now that we have met with the Dharma, now that we have this perfect human opportunity to work on our minds and develop our understanding, our wisdom, all of our qualities, we dedicate ourselves to doing that task, not just for our own welfare. Certainly that's a part of the equation, that we ourselves can attain the fullness of our being, our complete potential. But we do this primarily so we can benefit others once we have attained that state of perfection, once we have attained Buddhahood. So with all of this in mind and a deep compassion for all beings because we see clearly their situation, we generate the mind of bodhicitta that aspires to become fully enlightened so we can then lead others perfectly, spontaneously, effortlessly on the path to full awakening. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll begin. So again, just those of you who may have come into Zoom a little late, we're having some technical issues here. You all are the lucky ones tonight who get to see the slides. In the Gompa here, they won't be able to see any of the slides that I've prepared, but I'll try not. Oh, you got it up there now. Oh, as long as it's muted. Okay, never mind that. I guess they got things fixed here since while we were doing the meditation. So anyway, we had some interesting technical karma ripening. In our last class, we began our survey of pride. Again, we're going through, and as I've mentioned on a number of occasions, Venerable Robina calls this kind of looking at all of our roommates, and especially getting to know the really crazy roommates, the ones that are taking us off course, that are producing problems for us, you know, the disruptive roommates, if you will. So all of these things in our mind, these factors, we're primarily wanting to look at the ones that are not so wholesome, not so good for us. We've already taken a look at attachment or desire, the one that is craving after all those pleasant experiences and exaggerating the qualities of those and so on. And then we've looked at the one that is its companion, which is when things are not so pleasant. And we have the mind of anger or aversion that reacts to that in a way of wanting to push that out of our experience. So these are the two that we vacillate between day in and day out, you know, and throughout our day, you know, between seeing everything being wonderful and grasping at it, and then things go to hell and we just, you know, want to change the whole situation and get rid of whatever it is that's causing us any pain or suffering. So pride is also a delusion that's considered to be one of our major delusions. it seems, in my estimation, to be primarily rooted in attachment. Let me go ahead and share. Paused.
Recording in progress.
Okay, there it's back. Let's go ahead and do just a little recap of what we looked at towards the latter part of last week when we were looking at pride. Whoops. So again, these are the 6 root afflictions. So we're going to finish off pride to begin with, and then we're going to go on to the third one. I'm reversing the order of these two because I think it is important to talk about pride first, and then we'll get into ignorance. Because as we saw last week, and as is mentioned in this slide, arrogance or pride is based on the view of a personal identity that apprehends an inherently existent I or mine, which is the main ignorance that we are trying to address on our spiritual path. There are many forms of ignorance, but this is something we're going to go into a little bit later tonight, is what is this view of a personal identity, this way that we have of looking at ourselves, and then of course that gets extended through our ignorance to looking at all phenomena as being inherently existent. But we'll go into that shortly. But this pride is working primarily with this sense of I, and it strongly grasps at an inflated or superior image of ourselves, kind of thinking of ourselves in that higher light, having superior qualities compared to others. This is from Geshe Rabtin's text. Self-importance is the term he uses for pride, and he says it's a distinct mental factor that, based upon the view of the transitory composite, this is also called often the view of the transitory collection. We'll hopefully have time to talk about that tonight as well. That's a very specific form of ignorance that was mentioned in the previous slide. That is apprehending either this inherent I or a sense of mine, a sense of the I being a possessor. And this strongly grasps at an inflated or superior image of oneself. So again, pride kind of starts with this idea of we are grasping at this sense of an I that is false. We're going to be going into this and examining the teachings. Many of you have had teachings on a number of occasions, I'm sure, about emptiness or selflessness. We have to begin to see that what is at the center of all of these delusions, and what really is the final antidote to every one of them, is to get past this erroneous view that we have, this false sense of a self. We think that there's a real person here, and on the basis of that, we defend that person and try to get what that person wants and needs. And in the process, we step on a lot of other people's toes, and we do a lot of harm. And this is what's been driving the whole show from beginningless time. Way back at the beginning of the course, remember how I showed you the tree of samsara? The roots are this ignorance. Primarily when we are looking at the self, the I, this person that we hold so tightly to. But again, this is also an ignorance that is grasping at all things to exist in this independent, concrete way. So pride looks at the I and elevates it to the superior status, thinking that, I've really got it going on in terms of whatever criteria that we are choosing to compare ourselves to others. And so this is, I'm not going to go through all the slides that I did last time. This is just to get us back into the ballpark, to understand what pride is all about. So to go more deeply into the 7 types of pride, again, I won't go into all of these in a lot of detail, but I do need to touch on them because I think they are important when we think about our own pride and how it manifests. Which one of these is happening at that particular time? The first 3 have this, as it says here, these 3 forms of self-importance are said to be materially oriented. Now that's kind of loose because material, what is material? If we think only in terms of physical things, this can also be in terms of knowledge or other qualities we have, internal qualities. But they arise in relation to such things as social standing, wealth. They can even arise in terms of our own Dharma knowledge. We can have a pride around our own wisdom or accumulation of teachings or what have you. He calls them lesser, greater, and extreme self-importance. So what's happening with these? The first one, lesser self-importance or pride, comes about through comparing oneself to those who appear to have less than oneself. It is the thought that considers, I am greater than those who have an inferior social position and who are poorer in knowledge and wealth than myself. I mentioned this last week, when we do this pride that is even comparing ourselves to those we consider inferior, we don't know other things that they might actually be superior to ourselves in regard to those qualities compared to what we are looking at, what we are observing. That's why I like how Geshe Rabtin put this in here, that they appear to be inferior to us. On the basis of that one criterion or a few criteria that we're looking at, we make the decision to relegate them to an inferior role and put ourselves in a superior position. And it's interesting how quickly that can come up. It's not something we necessarily think about. Remember, all of these delusions are conceptions. They are a conceptual mind, but we have these happening really, really quickly. Where we just immediately go into that place of, oh, I'm superior to everyone in the room, or I have more going on than that person, or whatever the case might be. Especially if there are signs that show that they have something, again, that they are inferior to us in regard to their wealth or position or what have you. But that's not the whole sum total of that person. The second one goes, why it's kind of greater self-importance, is that in this case, it's in relation to those who are actually equal to oneself. It considers, although they may be equal to me in their social position and so on, nevertheless, through my inner qualities of generosity, morality, and so on, I am superior to them. So we always, when we're doing this sort of judgment thing and being with others and comparing ourselves, we tend to even think if we're in a room full of equals, people who we know have the same sort of standing as us and what have you, same level of education or whatever the case might be, we somehow want to find something in ourselves that says, but I'm better. I'm better in regard to some other internal qualities or what have you. That's another form of pride, but it's becoming a little more challenging because we're actually at an equal level with these folks. The next one, as we see, is really distorted because we're going to be comparing ourselves to those who, in actuality, are superior to us and thinking that we're better to them. This one's, it shows how our pride can get really out of whack. Extreme self-importance takes as its object those who are superior to oneself and considers, even compared to those who have greater social standing, wealth, knowledge, and so on than myself, I am nevertheless superior. I mean, when you see it at really extreme things, like if I were to say, oh, the Dalai Lama, he's got nothing on me, right? I'm much better and da 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 da. I mean, that would be just, I kind of feel horrible even saying those words, right? It smacks of just hubris, right? That you're thinking of yourself in such a superior way in relation to a being who is so obviously superior to oneself. We do that with people who, again, it's not really an appropriate state of mind. Pride in itself is an inappropriate state of mind, but this is taking it to an extreme level. If I think that I'm actually better than those people who have greater qualities in myself, who are further along in their spiritual development, or even in regard to material things or what have you, well, then that's really a distorted view of myself. And it also, of course, makes us think lesser of others. So this is we're going to be looking at the faults of pride because that's one of the main ways that we can overcome it. But these first three, if we examine this, we can see how our pride once more can really go out of control. The fourth one is called egoistic self-importance in Geshe Rabtin's text. It's kind of elevated by a sense of I, that same sense of I we've been talking about, but where we're taking that up a notch, if you will. This conceited attitude, he says, is an inflated state of mind that results from imagining one's aggregates of body and mind to be something perfect. We kind of think so highly of ourselves in regard to who we are, this strong sense of an identity that we can take to this extreme level. It then strongly conceives of that which is not a self-existent person to actually be a self-existent person. Self-existent is a synonym for inherently existent, all these things that we're going to talk about later tonight that are involved in our ignorance. And of that which does not belong to such a self-existent person to belong to such a self-existent person. So this pride is kind of an interesting one. We can say that our ignorance, that we're going to be going into, this ignorance that is holding to this strong sense of a self, is there a lot of the time. But with this pride, it's like we're looking at who we are and this strong sense that there's a real me here. And then we're taking some delight in that, having some conceit around that. Aren't I beautiful, wonderful, handsome, fun to be with, whatever, all these things that we think about ourselves that we just are embellishing our own state of or sense of who we are. So it's very egoistic. It's very much revolving around this sense of an I that we're now seeing in just such a superior way, just on the basis of our mind, our body, whatever, and thinking that we have all these kind of things compared to other people that make us superior. So this one doesn't necessarily involve other people. It's really a pride that we take in ourselves. The fifth one is called full-blown self-importance or full-blown pride. Negative human qualities, that is, all activities that arise from attachment, hatred or anger, bewilderment, ignorance, are countered by the superior qualities of mental absorption, concentration, and meditation. Full-blown self-importance is the grossly inflated attitude of one who, without having realized any of these superior qualities, is convinced that he or she has. So this is the sense that we have with this, is that we're, although it is good to develop these qualities, to generate these positive attitudes and so on, if we think that we have them, possess them, and we really don't, well, that's a full-blown pride. That's inferring to ourselves things that we actually have not completed. We haven't developed those qualities at all. So this one is quite specific to our spiritual practice, it seems, giving ourselves those qualities that we have yet to attain. So once more, I mean, it might remind everyone that one of our lay vows that many of you have taken in the room, when you take refuge, you often take the lay vows, the one about lying, the fourth of those 5 vows. It's not broken unless you lie about your spiritual attainments, your spiritual qualities. So again, we should be very careful in the way that we talk to others and the language that we use and so on, to infer that one has deeper spiritual realizations and accomplishments, and what one does possess is really a very serious thing. It could be breaking our vows, but it also is this sense of pride in thinking that we're better than what we actually are. So this is an important one to pay attention to in regard to our spiritual practice as well, the way in which that can manifest. The next one, self-effacing self-importance. There's actually 2 different ways that this is described. I'm going to present each of these to you. This is how Geshe Rabten describes it. He says, this is an inflated state of mind that considers, since I have only a fraction of the social standing, knowledge, etc., of those superior to me, I am truly humble and insignificant. It's almost like, this one's kind of interesting. It almost is like a pride of humility. Like where you think that you are the humblest person on the planet or something. I mean, not necessarily to that degree, but you think, okay, there's the Dalai Lama. I have just such a small fraction of the qualities that the Dalai Lama possesses. I'm just the humblest person in the world because I think that I'm just so meager compared to someone who is so outstanding, right? So that's one way that your pride could actually be manifesting. And, we've probably all seen people in this, and maybe we've been this way, where you try to always relegate yourself to this inferior position, but it leads to just kind of people being a bit full of themselves. I hate to put it that way, but it's still a sense of pride that is based on putting oneself last. Sounds strange. I mean, again, we ideally do want to have the humility that thinks about others first. I'm not saying that that isn't a good quality. It's not one of our virtuous mental factors, but it's definitely built into this. We do want to think of ourselves last, but to take pride in that. Well, aren't I the best? Because I'm always putting other people first. You know what I'm saying? The other way that's kind of interesting that this is described in another text is kind of another different type of distortion. In Jeffrey Hopkins' Meditation on Emptiness, which, as you might recall, that was the book that Venerable Rabina used when she was doing this type of course with us back in San Francisco in 1996. This is called there Pride of Slight Inferiority. This is a puffing up of the mind, thinking that one is just a little lower than others who are actually greatly superior. So I might, think of like the Dalai Lama, compare myself to the Dalai Lama and say, yeah, the Dalai Lama's got a lot going on, but I'm just a little bit beneath him. I'm just, a few qualities shy of him or something, which once more is, for me to say it, maybe some of you can say it, maybe other teachers or, lamas and what have you can say it, but I can't say that. I can't think that. So this slight inferiority is kind of like you want to hang out in their tier, but you admit that you're a little less than them, which is kind of, again, a different type of pride and obviously distorted. As you see with many of these, there's a distortion in regard to them not even being accurate in terms of what they're assessing, all the way back to even the one that's looking at people that appear as inferior to us. As I mentioned then, they might actually be superior to us in many different other ways. So again, we do have to be kind of careful with how pride can be very ignorant of what the reality is and making these different assessments of ourselves in comparison to others and so on. The last one is called distorted self-importance or pride. And an example of distorted self-importance would be the inflated attitude of a morally degenerate person who considers himself to be morally upright and virtuous. I'm not going to give any suggestions. You might have your own mind thinking about certain people in our world who might fit that. Thus, it is distorted since it makes us believe that we are endowed with wholesome qualities that in fact are lacking. Again, as I mentioned previously in this course, we should be looking at ourselves rather than at other people. But if we see them in other people, if we see these qualities or these senses of pride in other people, remember, you wouldn't get that, be able to see it if you didn't have some of that in yourself. So perhaps we've gotten better at controlling that. Perhaps we aren't going to take pride in being an immoral person falsely, like thinking that we're some virtuous, wonderful, magnificent person on the basis of behaving badly. But nonetheless, if we do see it in others, be reminded of the fact that these forms of pride manifest in all of us. And they're a distortion that, again, can lead to a lot of problems. That's what we're going to look at in terms of how do we counteract all these different types of pride. The antidotes to those are often to, mentioned earlier, first one, to see the faults of pride. And one of the big faults is that we then have a skewed and distorted attitude towards others on the basis of that. So this slide goes into some of these faults of pride that are a useful antidote. Once more, with all of these antidotes, it's worthwhile to meditate on them somewhat. And then when our pride arises, to be able to bring that out and use it as an antidote in the moment. If you're not familiar with them through meditation, it can be very hard to bring these to mind. The faults of pride, as it says on there, include its prevention of the attainment of any new knowledge of the Dharma and the generation of any new insights and realizations. We spoke about this last week. This is one of the biggest faults of pride on our spiritual path, that it blocks us from learning from others and learning new information because we think we already have it. We think that we're already quite realized or what have you. The second one there, it's causing one to be reborn in the lower realms. This is actually, if we have a prideful mind, it can lead us to actions that can cause a rebirth in the lower realms by denigrating others, what have you, even mistreating others, or in a position of lower status when in the higher realms. It's kind of interesting. Again, we do have those different results from karmas. One of the karmic results that we have is a result that is similar to the cause in terms of our experience. So when we have been prideful and thinking more of ourselves and elevating ourselves to the superior position that is contrary to where we actually are, it ripens into us being in an inferior position. Because our pride has been all about looking down on others, thinking of ourselves as being superior. So we then, in our human rebirth, we might end up in a very inferior position. Again, inferior in regard to a number of qualities, but these are things that we can be aware of, is that our pride is not going to lead to good results. Karmically, it will cause us to, again, potentially be reborn in a lower realm or in a position of lower status. The last one there, its ability to make us negligent of the welfare of others and to harm them when they denigrate us. So this is a big one. People who are prideful, because of their stance and their view of people who are inferior to them, often pay no heed to how they might harm them through their actions. They do things that they don't see the effects on other people because they think that that's what they need to do. Their pride invests them in that sense of self. What's the word for it? Kind of seeing themselves in that superior way that allows them to look upon others and not be cognizant of how they might suffer. We kind of think so much of ourselves that we can't even bring in the suffering of other beings. And in the process, we can do a lot of harm to others through a prideful mind. So once more, if we see beings in our world who are behaving in that way, let it be a reminder of the faults of pride rather than something to kind of grab onto and, make fun of people or, gossip about or whatever the case might be. Rather, let it be a reminder that this poor being who is doing this from a prideful state of mind is going to have these disadvantages, these faults that will arise from that state of mind. That's the first one. And generally, with each of these afflictions, it is important to meditate a bit on what are the faults of that particular affliction. This is often a very powerful way to counteract it. The second one is to contemplate categories of knowledge not known and qualities that are not yet realized. This is actually the more kind of traditional one that is set out in a lot of the Lamrim texts, is that since pride, as it says here, causes us to feel superior and even imagine qualities and knowledge we actually do not possess, it can be overcome by thinking about the many categories of phenomena in the sciences that we do not yet know fully, and also by reflecting on the qualities and stages of the path that we have not yet realized or have only realized partially. Okay. So what I think the text that they often point to as something that can be really quite humbling is the text that we studied in the master's program, our third out of the 5 texts that we studied. It's called Abhidharma Kosha. Abhidharma is the study of kind of phenomenology. It's usually translated as manifest knowledge, but the Buddha taught on a lot of different things. And the Buddha didn't teach necessarily always in accord with what we know from Western science nowadays. But nonetheless, a lot of what is in the Abhidharma teachings is really quite technical and involved and about the different realms of existence and the beings in them and all the realizations and the delusions. In fact, the information that I'm presenting is part of this course, this text of Lowrick, minds and mental factors and so on. This is actually encompassed in Abhidharma. So they say that often if we are getting really prideful around our Dharma knowledge, just go to one of those texts. There's been a translation of one of the commentaries on the Abhidharma Kosha, Vasubandhu's text that we studied in the master's program. And just reading a few pages of it is really humbling. You just kind of like go, oh my gosh, I can't make anything out of this. Again, it's not to make us feel bad. It's to make us kind of get back down to earth. If pride is this puffed up state of mind, well, then we need to deflate the mind a bit and go back to that place of acknowledging that we have a lot to learn. We have a lot of qualities to develop. I mean, have any of us in the room really realized renunciation even, which is, prior to bodhicitta? And, have we realized to any degree, even conceptually, the wisdom of emptiness that we're going to talk about when we get to ignorance, the antidote to that? We have to be, kind of in line with where we actually are. Then pride won't arise. If we are cognizant of our own accomplishments, it's not to mean you don't have any self-confidence. Doesn't mean that you can't, be in some way proud, if you will, of what you have accomplished. But don't take it to that level of this deluded pride, of feeling so superior about ourselves because we might possess a few good qualities that we've managed to cultivate on the basis of a lot of other beings involved in it. That's coming up as one of the antidotes as well, is to think about how what we have and everything is not cultivated in isolation. It's cultivated on the basis of so many others who have contributed to our ability to have what we have. So again, this is an important one to kind of bring us back down to earth, realize all the things that we don't know. So this is the one pertaining to self and others. Contemplate the equality of self and others and how others contribute to our well-being. We might think, certainly in our Western world, we have this concept of like the self-made person, right? The self-sufficient person, like we've done it all for ourselves. And we certainly see that in some of our, people who are in high status in terms of wealth and what have you in our world. But they did not accomplish that completely on their own, right? Many others contributed to that. This whole concept of self and other is one where we are, there's no self without other, there's no other without self. And it's always kind of, when we look at the other person, they're seeing themselves as self and us as other. This is an interdependent relationship. And we are holding ourselves to have the superior status when in reality, we're quite equal to others. And regardless of whatever qualities and things we have right now, we're all the same in our fundamental situation. We're all unenlightened beings, still dealing with the sufferings of samsara. So here it says, since pride involves seeing the superiority of self and the inferiority of others, think about the interdependence of self and other, as well as the way that all our happiness, both temporal and ultimate, arises from others, thus inducing a natural sense of humility. And I have to say that when I worked in corporate America in San Francisco, I had the good fortune to work for Levi Strauss and Company, which was a very progressive company and very civic-minded and wanting to benefit others and so on. And the president of the company at that time, Bob Haas, who was one of the descendants of Levi Strauss, actually embodied so much of this humility. He knew that he depended, and the whole company depended upon all of us who were workers, all of us who had a contribution to make to the success of the company. And he always had that as a communicating point whenever there'd be gatherings where he would talk about what's going on with the company and so on. He would often go to people individually if there were things going on in their lives to try to show his concern for them and everything, which I felt was completely genuine. He actually did that to me when I was having some difficulties in the early 90s in my personal life. And so I think when we see that in others who have, again, he was superior to me in terms of wealth and status and all of that, but he was able to see others in terms of that interdependence, seeing that if he wasn't attendant to the way in which other people were working and doing what they did, that he would, lose out on that as well. That we are all in it together. If we care for others, then we are cared for in turn. Of course, that's what so much of karma is based on. When we protect the lives of others, our lives are protected. When we protect the possessions of others and don't steal from them, well, then we also have integrity in our own resources and don't have to worry about them being taken away. That's how karma works. So again, having that understanding really deflates our pride because everything I have depends upon others being, involved in producing the karma for that, in helping me to have that. Look at the interdependence we have in our world in terms of beings contributing to the food on our plate and so on. We're not self-sufficient and kind of standing alone with that ability to be there apart from others. Another one is to think about death and other forms of suffering that we all experience. Pride makes us think more highly of ourselves, but all sentient beings, ourselves included, are subject to death as well as aging, sickness, getting what we don't want, not getting what we do want, and so on. All the ways that the Buddha taught what he called, again, he referred to as dukkha, as suffering. You often say that death is the great equalizer, so this is something that when we contemplate our own death and the fact that there's no difference between myself and all other beings who have to face the reality of death. And we all have to face all these other ones that I enumerated. We're all going to have to deal with aging. Of course, if we live that long, some beings die before they even get a chance to deal with old age and what have you. They're dealing with the continuum of aging, but they haven't dealt with the difficulties, the painful aspects of old age. Illness. Illness is something I don't know anybody in my life that has never been ill. We all have moments of illness. We all have to deal with things that we don't like. We all are struggling to get what it is that we do want and like to have in our lives. There's no difference, really. So once more, when we think about that aspect of our existence, it can bring down this prideful mind that thinks, oh, I've got it all going on, got it so made. Well, the reality is, no matter how much good stuff you have in your life, you're going to have to suffer. It's part and parcel of being a sentient being. So once more, these are different antidotes. As I've said before, when we're going through these antidotes, take an examination of them, do your meditation on them. If there's some that feel that they are more salient for you, that they really speak to you and you go, wow, I think that would really help me humble myself, bring myself down when I see my prideful mind arising. Well, then work with those. Now, that's the whole thing, is that we want to be able to use the ones that we feel are hitting the target. If it's not hitting the target, then change to another one, change to one of the other ones and see if it will actually have a reduction in the amount of pride that's going on. Hopefully an elimination of it in the moment. This is what we're trying to work with. And these ones that I've been introducing, by the way, are what we often call the temporal antidotes, meaning that they are in the moment what we want to apply, and they really are addressing that affliction head on. But they're not necessarily going to be effective with other afflictions, other delusions. So for example, when we talked about the mind of attachment, we said that what we want to do is think about the unfavorable qualities, the unattractive qualities of that to bring our mind back down to reality, because we're embellishing the object with so much of this good stuff that we think is there, and it really isn't there. However, with anger, we want to look at the being in a more positive light. We want to have a mind of love and compassion for them. These two don't work vice versa, with each other then. I don't look at sentient beings with more love and things that might actually cause my attachment to become greater, possibly if I get distorted with that. And I certainly don't want to look at the unattractive aspects of those people who I'm angry or upset at. So once more, these temporal antidotes are very specific to what is going on in the moment in regard to our minds. The ultimate antidote is what we're going to be examining shortly when we talk about ignorance. The ultimate antidote is the wisdom of emptiness. That's because all of these delusions, pride, anger, attachment, all of the secondary ones, the close afflictions, belligerence, spite, resentment, and so on that we looked at in regard to anger, the haughtiness, and can't remember all of them with attachment. But anyway, all of those are rooted in that ignorance. If we eliminate the ignorance that they are rooted in, then they all disappear. This is why that's the ultimate antidote. And it's something that we can bring into our minds if we have an awareness of emptiness, if we've meditated on it and have a strong enough awareness to think at that moment that what is going on lacks any real existence, any solid existence. And we'll get into that in a moment. But pride has its temporal antidotes, and these are what we just went through, all of these various ones that help us to kind of take it down a notch. So let's go on then to ignorance or confusion. Once more, this is sometimes presented in lists as the third one because these first three are really the main way that our minds are getting caught up in delusion. From the root of ignorance, the third one, especially the ignorance we're going to go into in a little more detail. There's different forms of ignorance, as I said earlier. There is this distorted response to what is pleasant, which is where number one comes into play, attachment or desire for those things that are pleasant. We have those pleasant feelings that arise in the mind based on contact with objects that are pleasing for us. And then we discriminate them as objects that we want and embellish them with all kinds of qualities that aren't there, and we grasp at them. And then anger or aversion, where we see something, experience something that is unpleasant. And we embellish that with unpleasantness, and we want to get rid of it, push it away, sometimes even harm it in the process of being separated from it. They're all rooted in ignorance, though. And as I was saying just a few minutes ago, pride itself is rooted in ignorance. Afflicted doubt, afflicted views, we'll look at those briefly, but essentially these main ones we really need to focus on. So as I said, often the first three are presented as what we call the three poisons or the three root afflictions. Whereas in this presentation, we have a longer list of 6 that are primary in terms of the main ones we need to overcome. So let's look at ignorance or confusion. I think one text even translated this as bewilderment. We had that on the screen earlier. That's kind of a phrase or a word we don't use so much in our culture, I think, anymore. It's a state of unknowing brought about by the mind being unclear about the nature of things, such as the Four Noble Truths, the 4 truths of the Aryas, karma and its results, and the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Those are just examples. They are not the full extent of our ignorance. This definition of ignorance is held in common by all Buddhist tenet systems, although each system has its own unique way of defining ignorance. I've modeled this course after one of the basic program courses. I've mentioned this a few times. That is all about awareness, minds, and getting to know our minds in a much more technical way, but it's where all of what I'm presenting to you is rooted in those studies. There's another set of studies in the basic program that's well worth taking at some point, which is called tenets. Tenets are philosophical systems, and there are 4 main philosophical systems that the Buddha taught. And in those, we see that there is a gradation of how this ignorance is defined. If we look at what did we call it? That picture that I had of the tree, with the different things, aspects of the tree. As I said earlier, the roots of the tree are ignorance. Well, what is that ignorance? Many of these Buddhist traditions say that there are coarser forms of ignorance. I'm not going to go into those so much because I don't want to take this course all the way down into it being more philosophical. What I want to present to you, of course, is the final view of ignorance. What is it that the Buddha says is the actual root of samsara? What is it that is keeping us going from life to life? And it is the driving force behind all of our states of afflictions. When pride arises, when belligerence arises, when anger arises, all of these things are rooted in this fundamental ignorance that is a mistaken conception. And one thing I will say in terms of that form of ignorance, in that slide, it said it is a not knowing. That's a more general way of talking about ignorance, right? To say it's a state of unknowing, that we don't know exactly how things are. We don't know about the Four Noble Truths. We don't know about karma and its results. We don't have an awareness of the three jewels. That's a form of ignorance that's really important to acknowledge. I mean, I can say with perfect confidence that I have pretty much in ignorance of quantum physics and things. I've tried to understand it by reading about it a little bit, but I can say my understanding is so weak and so meager that it would be hard for me to even discuss it with somebody who's knowledgeable about those things. Ignorance is generally defined in our culture as a not knowing. The one thing to keep in mind about this deeper form of ignorance is that it is actually a misknowing as well. Not only do I not know how things exist, I actually think they exist in an erroneous way, in a false way. So we've got kind of a lot of work to do to undermine this ignorance because we are believing things to exist in a way that is totally contrary to how things actually do exist. So we're going to go into this. We'll use the more technical language for it, but as this whole course, I'm really wanting to make this extremely practical. How do we use that knowledge to undermine our delusions? How do we use the wisdom that's the antidote to ignorance to actually keep us from getting angry, attached, whatever the case might be? So let's go back to the slides. And then I do want to go back to our text. Again, I don't want to forget our text by Venerable Thupten Gyatso, I think is his name. Yeah, Gyatso, I think, pretty sure. Anyway, Geshe Rabten in his text defines ignorance in this way. He says, ignorance is an afflicted state of unknowing brought about by the mind being unclear about the nature of such things as the Four Noble Truths, the law of cause and effect, karma, the triple gem, and so forth. It has the function of acting as a basis and a root for all other afflictions, as well as the defiled actions and states of birth that they produce. So this is an interesting point in terms of states of birth that they produce. This more fundamental view of ignorance is said to be the root of all of our rebirths in samsara. It's the force in our minds that keeps us going from life to life, accumulating the karma that ripens at the end of each life that propels us into our next existence. In that way, we can say that that ignorance is the main root of samsara, is the thing that is the driving force that needs to be abolished in order for us to be free of all of this, to attain nirvana and, of course, to attain Buddhahood eventually. But it's important that we talk about another form of ignorance that is operating. And that's one that was set out in that list of the few things that were a state of unknowing in those definitions. That's ignorance of the law of karma, cause and effect. So it's interesting. I'll share on the screen a few slides from Jeffrey Hopkins where he talks about these two and what goes on. Let me going to jump to that. I'm sorry, I thought that would be the next slide. But let's go through what Geshe Rabten says, because this is getting us into talking about that deeper ignorance and then the ignorance that is also playing a role, the ignorance of karma. Thus, the ignorance that we are discussing here is the confused, bewildered quality of consciousness that obscures us from knowing things clearly. It acts as the basis for, but is distinct from, the ignorance that falsely conceives of this self-existent, inherently existent, substantially existent person, different terms for it. This more specific quality of ignorance will be explained when we deal with the view of the transitory composite or collection. I'm going to talk about that tonight because I want to include it in here because it's the more specific form of ignorance that's driving the whole show. Ignorance in general is the state of unknowing, but it can be unknowing about a variety of things. But generally speaking, as he says here on the screen, there are two types of ignorance. This is what I was just talking about. Confusion about the meaning of reality itself, the nature of things. Ignorance that is bewildered about the nature of the self, about the nature of all phenomena. And secondly, confusion about such things as the law of cause and effect. So Jeffrey Hopkins, in talking about this, says the following. He delineates these two with this language. He says ignorance is of two types, meaning two main types. There can be, once more, a lot of different forms of ignorance. But the first is obscuration with respect to actions and their effects, karma. And secondly, obscuration with respect to emptiness, suchness, as it's called here. The latter serves as the causal motivation for all rebirth and psychic existence, samsara. So once more, he does say, what's at the root of all of our suffering is this mistaken mind that is not seeing emptiness, that is not knowing things, that things lack this way of existing, that we falsely are holding on to, that we think is so real, that is the guiding force behind all of our delusions again. All right. That second type of ignorance, having an obscuration with regard to that, is the root of samsara. It causes all existence within psychic existence. You are here because of your ignorance. You're embodied in this form, having this human existence because of your ignorance. Your ignorance was together with some really virtuous stuff that got you this human life, but nonetheless, it was still rooted in ignorance, as we saw when we went through the tree of samsara. In regard to those, though, he says, in terms of operational motivation at the time of actions, though, obscuration with regard to actions and their effects, karma, is specified as the cause of accumulating actions that result in birth in bad migrations. And what does that mean? That means that if we are ignorant of the law of cause and effect and behave from that place of ignorance, we're more likely than not to create the causes for unfortunate existences. And I don't need to go into the lower realms of rebirth. If you've studied Lamrim, you know what those are. We can look in our world and see the realm of animals. That is one of them. Animals having an existence that we might look at in terms of our pets and think it's actually a very cushy existence. But in regard to most animals, they have a really horrid existence with lots of fear, lots of suffering. But even if you talk about the minds of our pets, Lama Zopa Rinpoche said, if you had the mind of an animal for like 5 seconds, you would never want to be reborn as an animal. The mind is so dull and ignorant, it doesn't have the ability to kind of know what's going on, kind of always questioning, always needy, always looking for something. So when we look at these lower realms, what is being said by this is that the main driving force that causes you to be reborn in the lower realms is if you don't understand karma. If you don't have a good working knowledge of karma, well, then you're going to keep creating the causes for lower realm existences to end up in those unfortunate states through following the delusions and engaging in the actions that propel you into those states. It's just how karma works. This is, again, another reason why our hearts should break when we look at sentient beings and we see that they lack even a knowledge of karma. Most of them don't follow this at all. Right? I mean, they might have some sense of like the ramifications of their actions, but usually it's quite limited. Most people probably think that if they don't get caught doing these particular bad things, stealing from others or whatever the case might be, then there's no ramifications. There's no result from that. It just gets kind of swept under the rug because they didn't get caught. Well, that's not how karma works. Karma is an imprint on our minds. It ripens eventually into whatever it is conditioned to create. And all of our negative karma creates more suffering. It creates rebirth in the lower realms. So in this way, this form of ignorance, we have to check up with ourselves. Even though many of us in the room might say, well, I've had teachings on karma. I know how karma works. I know that I shouldn't be doing this, 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 and this. Well, are you doing those things? Are you actually avoiding creating the causes for lower rebirths? And of course, are you purifying those acts that you do engage in that could cause lower rebirth? That's, again, a whole nother course talking about purification, karma, and what have you. But this is an important thing to acknowledge, is that most of us, even if we have some knowledge of karma, are we really living our lives in accord with those teachings? Or are we still under the cloud of some form of ignorance about it? Thinking, oh, well, yeah, I understand that, but I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing. Well, hopefully we're making progress. And if we aren't at least trying to make progress, to move forward, to lessen those delusions, to lessen our actions, then, I think we have to really check up. Because this is a grosser form of ignorance. This is the ignorance so that propels us into the unfortunate existences. Now, what Jeffrey Hopkins goes on to say in the very next slide, continuing on from this, is that the first one, or the second one then, obscuration with respect to emptiness or suchness, to the true nature of phenomena, is specified as the cause of accumulating actions that result in birth in the happy migrations. Well, how does that work? Once more, when we talk about this being the root of samsara, well, it's driving us to have a lot of these other distorted states of mind, but usually those distorted states of mind and the actions we create on the basis of those that lead us to the lower rebirths are kind of motivated by an ignorance of karma, by an ignorance of all of that. Whereas if we have an awareness of karma and we start engaging in positive actions that lead to rebirth in the three upper realms, once more, you got this human existence through the force of those types of actions. You engaged in virtue in the past that led you to have that ripen at the end of your previous life and propel you into this human existence. Yay, go good karma. Wonderful that I had that I planted that seed. Well, again, maybe I planted that seed within an understanding that karma is operative and I need to be attending to that and I need to create the causes for my good existence. But I'm still going to only get an existence, excuse me, an existence in samsara because I'm still being driven by the ignorance that is obscured with regard to the nature of reality. Because I'm still rooted in samsara. Remember with the tree of samsara, I don't have the slide right in front of me to show you. It's at the beginning of this whole set, and I don't necessarily want to go all the way back there and then find my way back. But there's the trunk of the tree that comes up with different states of mind, those that are virtuous, those that are non-virtuous. On the basis of that, we have the branches that are the actions that we engage in. Virtuous karma over here, non-virtuous over here. We create results that are commensurate with that are in line with that. From virtuous actions, we have happy results, good rebirths, and so on. From the non-virtuous actions, we have unhappy results, unpleasant results, rebirth in the lower realms. So this whole side of the tree is primarily being driven by our lack of understanding about the law of cause and effect, because we keep doing things that propel us into those unfortunate states. But with some knowledge of that, we can get those good existences. We can create a whole strength to this side and have wonderful results, but they're still within samsara. They're still rooted in our ignorance, this second type of ignorance. This is why we have to attend to this. This is why we need teachings on emptiness and to be in the presence of these great masters who have realized emptiness and to kind of receive their blessings and inspiration to be able to actualize this. Because this is the key that will get you not only out of samsara, but to enlightenment. The wisdom of emptiness is key in both of those results. So once more, when we talk about ignorance, it's important that we delineate at least these two major things, right? There can be ignorance of a lot of other things, as was said in the definition. I can be ignorant, and I was ignorant at some point earlier in this life of the three jewels. I had no awareness about the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, no awareness about the Four Noble Truths, and so on. All of our Lamrim studies in terms of everything other than the emptiness teachings are primarily to help us to deal with those sorts of things that we are ignorant of. We have to develop some wisdom, some knowledge of them, so that we then start living our lives in accord with how conventional reality is. But if we stop there, we'll never deal with the deeper ignorance, which is where we have to understand what ultimate reality is. How do things exist in their final mode of existence, rather than just in a conventional way that we can talk about? This is something we're going to get into when we get into these teachings shortly about undermining that ignorance. So let's go back to slides. I don't know if I have. Let me stop it here. Let me go to our text. I want to make sure that once more that I do utilize the text that I'm trying to use for this course that you all have, hopefully. So here we are with ignorance. There was a nice little quote on pride there right at the end. This is on page 110. I'll let you read that on your own. You all have access to the text. Let's look at ignorance and how it's described here by Venerable Gyatso. He says, in Tibetan, it's called ma rigpa. Rigpa is the same root as lo rik. It means kind of awareness, knowing. Well, this is ma rigpa. It's not knowing. Ma is a negative. In the context of being a simple lack of awareness of things, Ignorance is a type of mental darkness, a confusion about the ultimate reality of things, their emptiness of inherent existence, and of the relative reality of karmic cause and effect. Nothing new there, just reiterating in his words what I just said. Those are the two main forms of ignorance we hone in on. Ignorance of the relative reality, the conventional reality of karma, and then the confusion about the ultimate reality of things, their emptiness of inherent existence. Okay, so then continuing, it says there, in the context of being a wrong idea or wrong view, ignorance is the mistaken, self-grasping conception that is opposite to the wisdom realizing selflessness. This is what I said earlier, that it is not only a not knowing, it's a misknowing. It's thinking of things in a complete opposite way to how they actually exist. Within our general unknowing of how things actually exist, things appear to exist in a wrong way, and ignorance apprehends them to exist in this wrong way. This wrong appearance of true existence is an illusion that appears to our mind as a result of imprints from past lives. Not knowing any better, we grasp at these false appearances to be true and behave accordingly. Believing in a truly existing me and holding our body and mind to be mine, the possessions of a truly existing me, we become self-centered in our attitude to the world. Then the afflictions of doubt, pride, attachment, anger, and so on are unleashed. Again, because that's the root problem. So we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight. I'll be able to fit everything that I want to into tonight. This process by which we have this confused state of mind arising. But I like to compare it, one analogy, the Buddha used a number of analogies for this sense of things being illusory, kind of appearing to us in a way that is different to how they actually exist. And I always use the one, and some of you heard me teach with this analogy before, and we have to go through it again, but it is a really rich analogy because I think that it works in so many different ways. It's not perfect, but we don't have a perfect analogy for this because we're dealing with something that, again, is pervading all of our experiences. Everything appearing to us in this false way that we are holding to be true, but is not how they exist at all. So let's use the example of a dream. And I don't know your dreams. I don't have that kind of clairvoyance where I can see your minds and know what your dreams are and what have you. But I assume you dream like me. And that's why the Buddha used this analogy, because I think we all dream in a similar way. If you are a lucid dreamer, you may not dream in this way. But most people, when they go into their dreams, begin to buy into these appearances of dream objects, dream people, dream animals, dream environments, dream this, dream that, as if it were as real as our waking life. We even have a lot of emotions arise in our dream, right? You can get very excited in a dream at something beautiful and wonderful happening. You can be very fearful in a dream, right? At nightmares and things happening that are really disturbing to your mind. You know, we can have anger arise in a dream. We can have a lot of things arise in a dream on the basis of what are just dream appearances. They're not real. When we wake up from our dream, of course, we know then that all of that we were dreaming about, if it was a really delightful, beautiful, wonderful dream, you might even have some remorse, like, oh, I want to go back to that dream. We might try to force ourselves to go back to sleep thinking we're going to reappear in that dream and have that experience. It's all a dream appearance. It doesn't exist in the way that our real experiences are outside of the dream world in our waking life. Our waking life and our dream life are still kind of distorted in this bigger view that we're getting to. But this is the analogy, is that I am buying into everything just like I buy into my dream objects. I give them an inflated sense of how they exist, thinking that they are as real as my waking life. And I totally buy into it, even when things, I mean, sometimes dreams can get pretty illogical, right? Things happening that you don't like, oh my gosh, now what's going on over here? Even when it's like that, we still think it's real. We still think there's a sense of reality there. And we keep buying into it and having all these emotions on the basis of it. It's a wonderful way to think about what's going on in our waking life, in all of our moments, even in our dream. This is happening at a subtler level. We think things exist in a way that is in line with how they appear, but they don't have that reality at all. Not one atom of it. So the process of undermining this ignorance, of course, is to wake up, to begin to see things as they actually exist, lacking that way of existing, being empty of that. That's why we use this term emptiness. It becomes very confusing for our Western minds because it makes it sound like there's nothing there. Like, you totally have gotten rid of everything. It's empty. It's not existent. That is not what we mean by emptiness. Things still do exist. They just don't exist in this concrete, self-established way that is comparable to the way dream objects appear to us. Again, to go back to that analogy. So we have to wake up. We have to see that this false appearance that we are clinging to as real, just as we are doing that in our dreams, is the problem. And it's around us all the time. That's the thing, is like we are like fish in water that can't really even think about the water because it's what we live in. It's our environment in a way, not just physically in the world around us, but everything appearing to us in that way. All of our thoughts appearing to be inherently real. All of our objects that our senses are knowing to be inherently real. All of our, everything that we generate, that we are experiencing in this life, is having that false appearance. And usually we are grasping at it as real. We think that it has that level of reality. So this is what Venerable Gyatso is talking about in that passage, is really kind of going into the mechanics of that, if you will. And of course, what is happening, let me talk just a little bit more before we go back to the slides. What is happening at the deepest level is really this sense of grasping to this I. And we often divide these two in terms of the I, the self, the person, especially the one that we are thinking of in relation to this collection of stuff, our mind and body, versus all other phenomena. All other phenomena, that's a huge category of stuff, right? That includes, tables and chairs and animals and everything else, all these things. But, we tend to have the driving force behind all of our difficulties and problems is this looking at ourselves and thinking that we are real, that this sense of an I, or as was said there in his description, a mine, which, as we're going to see, is the sense of possessing something. That gets us into a lot of trouble, right? My pleasure, my enemies and things that are distorting to me and having, causing problems for me. We relate to everything from this axis of this sense of a real I or mine. This is one of these false views that is being set out in these root afflictions as well. We're going to go to that in a moment, but essentially that is a form of ignorance. Our ignorance is manifested with regard to a lot of things, but where it becomes especially unhealthy is when we are grasping at this sense of an I. Because once more, that becomes the axis upon which all of this is rotating. All of my experiences of what brings me pleasure, what brings me sadness and displeasure and da-da-da-da, all of this has to do with trying to defend and protect this strong sense of a person that we think is real here, together with all of this stuff. And we have to undermine that. That's one of the biggest tasks that we have to engage in. We have that false sense of everything existing this way, but nonetheless, this is one of the main views or distortions that we need to get rid of. So what we're going to do in terms of working with that more specific form of ignorance is jump to the sixth of these root afflictions, but not all of them, because as you see there are 5 afflicted views. Afflicted views mean views that have some level of distortion involved in them. The first of these is the view of the transitory group. This is what Venerable Gyatso calls it. I often refer to it as the view of the transitory collection. We'll talk about what that means, group or collection. And then he goes on to describe it further as a real I and mine. So what we are doing with this view is we are looking at this collection of stuff, which is our body, all the parts of our body, our mind, all the various aspects and parts of our mind. Those are the 2 things that the Buddha said are the basis for this sense of an I. We are looking at that, and although there's no real I there, we're going to look at the mechanism by which we come to think of this as an I, but although there's no real I there, we think that there's a real I there. Once more, this is that ignorance that's driving the whole show, is really feeling like there's a real me. Rinpoche would use these words, real me. And I don't want to, when we negate this, I'm not meaning that there is no reality at all. It's just that the way we think of real is exactly what we're trying to negate. Thinking that things set themselves up, that they have their own identity, that they exist independently on their own. This is what we're trying to negate. I know we're jumping into a bit of a deep end with this affliction compared to some of the others we looked at, but once more, this is what's driving the whole show. What's giving rise to that feeling of separation from others, separation from the objects, all of the things we need to bring those things in to please the sense of an I, to get rid of the things that displease that sense of an I. This is the whole driving force. Let's go back to Venerable Gyatso's text and look a little bit more at what he says about afflicted view. First, just so we understand, we'll go back to maybe a few of these afflicted views. I'm not going to go through everything that's in this text because I think it's more information than we can handle in the time that we have. But afflicted views are the basis upon which all the other afflictions arise and cause so much trouble. In general, he says, a view is a belief that is held to be true. It can be innate, meaning inborn, that we have from life to life, or acquired, meaning that in this life, someone could introduce us to a view that we then adopt. It could also be correct or incorrect. The word view in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean afflicted or incorrect. But what we're talking about here is something that is incorrect. 5 incorrect or afflicted views are mentioned here. The first is the ignorance mentioned above that we've been talking about quite specifically. The other 4 are further mistaken conceptions that are based upon this ignorance. So let's look at this one that again, he calls the view of the transitory group as a real I and mine. So, unaware of how a person is established to exist merely through the process of labeling I onto a physical and mental continuum that functions as a person, this mistaken view sees the body and mind, or some part of them, to be an independent, unchanging, real I. Or it sees them to be mine, the possession of an independent, unchanging, real self. So what is going on with this again is it is this ignorance, this form of ignorance, it's this afflicted view of the view of this transitory collection. It sees this stuff, views this stuff. And it's, viewing this stuff all the time, right? This is what we mean by our existence, a body that's breathing and brain functioning and what have you, so that we are able to continue to be in this human existence, the mind that is constantly going from here to there and having all kinds of thoughts and sensations and experiences arising. We are viewing all this in the sense of being some sort of a real I being here with those or among those. At an innate level, we sort of feel that it's there, but it's not necessarily the body or the mind. But we feel that there's got to be this real I here. We've created this I through our ignorance, and it isn't here at all. So let's look at a little bit more of what he says in this, because we do need to get to this subtler view of how this is being perceived. So continuing on that same page, 111, he says, a more subtle explanation of jigta, this view of a transitory collection, is that this ignorance observes not the body and mind themselves, but what we actually call the mere I, that is labeled upon our transient continuum of body and mind, that transitory collection, which does exist, right? Those do exist. They don't exist inherently, but they exist nonetheless. But it holds that collection of stuff, that transitory collection, to be this real self-existent I, which doesn't exist. When this view sees the body and mind as mine, the dominant apprehension of that thought is the apparent possessor, a real self-existent I. So what he's saying here is that when we get down to this very deeper level, this sense of an I that we are basing all this on is really lacking any of that way of existing. We use this term mere I. What we mean by that is it has no existence beyond us simply designating this as I, labeling this as I. It starts to move us into the reasoning of dependent arising that is so important in overcoming this ignorance, because we come to see that at the subtlest level, There's nothing more than the labeling of I. I think of this stuff as I, and I'm using my hand over all this, but it coats the entire thing, right? I think of this as I, and that thought of I is all that exists on this basis, right? We have to have a basis for the I. The basis is the body and mind. The sense of an I that we have is really just designated to this collection. There's nothing more than that. That's what we mean by mere I. Anything more than that doesn't exist. If we think that there's a real I here, that's our mistaken conception, this view of a transitory collection that holds it to exist in a way that is completely opposite to how it does exist. In the end, it lacks any of that independent, self-sufficient form of existence. It can't be established on its own because of various factors that give rise to it. It's something that, again, is in the end only established on the basis of me labeling this as I. I think of this stuff as I. Each of you think of your stuff as I. You have a strong sense of possessing those things, my body, my mind, what have you. These are all part and parcel of that fundamental ignorance that manifests in that way. And of course, gets us in trouble because we start relating from that fictitious point of view, thinking there's a real me over here. And then, of course, everyone around us thinks that their real me is over there, their real I. And then we all are like bumper cars that just keep hitting each other and trying to satisfy this fake sense of self. It doesn't exist. If we pull the rug out from underneath that, then there's nothing left to build all the other delusions on. The foundation is gone. The roots of the tree are uprooted. Okay. Let's go back to our slides then. All right. This is how it's described by the Dalai Lama and Venerable Children. The view of, they call it a personal identity, or again, view of the transitory collection, very common way it's referred to, is an afflictive intelligence. Remember when I talked about wisdom or intelligence, knowledge earlier? It's one of the 5 object ascertaining mental factors. We talked about it quite a few weeks ago. It's not necessarily virtuous. Intelligence or wisdom can be afflicted. People can hold particular views and ways of looking at things that are not in line with reality. So this is one of those. It's an afflictive intelligence that, when referring to the conventional I or mine, meaning the merely labeled I or mine, grasps it to be either inherently I or mine. It is called intelligence in the sense that it analyzes something. It is the root of samsara and acts as the basis for all afflictions. So when it comes down to it, we say it's the root of samsara, we mean that although we in general call the root ignorance, we're talking about a very specific form of ignorance that in lifetime after lifetime, when there's been the continuity of our mind now with a human existence, every one of us listening to this, having a human mind that is together with a human body, we think of this as I, but we think of it moreover as a real I. And on the basis of that, we get ourselves in trouble in samsara. And then when we go on to our next life, we have a new body with the continuity of a mind that might be very different in terms of how it is expressed, because a dog's mind is very different than a human being's mind. But nonetheless, we identify that as I. Dogs have a strong sense of I, of identity, of who they are. Every being is imbued with that false sense of a self that they've been carrying from lifetime to lifetime. And it has been giving rise to perpetuating their stay in samsara. Just more and more rebirths on the basis of that lie that we are buying into. And quote Venerable Rabina, she says that all of these delusions are based on a big fat lie. The lie is that there is a real person here. I'm not saying you don't exist once more. We have a tendency when we hear words like that to go, oh, I don't exist then. No, you do exist, but the way you exist is so subtle. Lama Zopa Rinpoche would say, it's almost as if you don't exist. All right. So let's go back to the slides. I'm not going to have time to finish all of this lecture, and it'll be kind of weird jumping in next week right in the middle of it. But Geshe Rabten describing this. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and pass this up. Let's go to this. This is really important for me to go through before we close tonight, because this is what how Lama Zopa Rinpoche explains this, and it's not like he came up with it on his own. It's just very succinct in the way that he talks about it. This is how our ignorance comes into play. First of all, the basis of the object appears, and that is labeled as the object that we are kind of holding on to, right? So the basis of the object, let's talk about this in regard to our I. And you each have your own basis for what you consider. What's the basis? The body and the mind, right? The transitory collection. We have that appearing, and we simply, again, are going to label it as I. Think of it as I. Each of you thinking of your body and mind as I, right? I mean, that's again just a label that's being given to it. At that point, there's really nothing wrong because that's the way that things actually exist, is being merely labeled. I think of this as I, you think of your stuff as I, and so on. And I think of these as flowers that are on the altar here, statues behind me, whatever. Everything I think of, I just kind of giving it a label. And we have lots of conventional labels for all the various phenomena that we have in our world, right? The diversity of things that exist. There's nothing wrong with the first step. In fact, we'd be very lost if we didn't have the first step. How would we know how to refer to each other and how to refer to our world and find things that function to do this and do that? It'd be kind of scary if we didn't do the first step. Nothing wrong with the first step. If you stopped there, it would be fine, right? Well, what happens is based on the fact that we have had this ignorance that has grasped at things as being real, the object then appears to exist from its own side. Step number 2 there. Now, to explain that, these are like these very subtle imprints in our mind that cause this false appearance. Because everything around us appears that way. It appears to have its own identity, to not be merely designated, merely imputed, as was done in the first step. When we see something like these flowers, we go, oh, flowers. We put the label on this. And that is the only way that flowers exist. What is out here are the bases for the flowers. And I am making a designation of flowers this, and we call these flowers in our language. They have different, linguistic tools to describe flowers in other languages and what have you. But we're talking about this concept of, something that grows from a plant that has petals and colors and whatever, I don't know, whatever you want to describe a flower as. That is, again, the first step, giving the label. But then it appears back to us as if there's flowers out here established on their own side. Like the flowers were just waiting for us to give them that label. They already have their flowerness from their own side. They exist as flowers from their own side. That's how they appear in the second step. What's the third step? We assent to that appearance. We agree to that appearance. We don't even question it. That's, again, what most sentient beings are dealing with. Once we've found Buddhism and begin to question how things appear, then we can begin to undermine our ignorance. But ignorance assents to that false appearance. Because, that's how it exists. There is a real me here. There is a real flower out there. There is a real computer, a real this, a real that. And I just put references on there. If you would like to read more on this, certainly in part 2 of our book that we've been going through, Venerable Gyatso's The World and Ourselves, there's some wonderful pages in there that talk about this. But this is the process by which we get into trouble. And of course, we have to begin to question all of that. Do things really exist in the way that they appear? We give a label to something like flowers, and then it appears back to us as if it were real from its own side. And we agree to that. This is why it is also hard to kind of get through all of this ignorance, is because it is imbued in everything that appears to us through our senses, through our conceptual mind that thinks about things. It permeates the entire experience. Just like in your dream state, all the dream objects are appearing to be real, whatever's going on, coming up and everything. And you're just buying into it and going along for the ride. And even when it's uncomfortable, you're just kind of staying there, and the delightful, delicious things come in and you get all attached to those. This is what we're doing in our waking life. And we don't realize it, that there's a false world that is appearing to us. Again, it does exist, but the way it exists is that first step, as being merely designated, merely imputed, just given that identity from the side of all of us who conventionally agree to call these flowers, so we can relate to it and go to the flower market and say, I'd like some yellow flowers. Okay, I have some here for you, right? We need conventional designations of things so that we can refer to all the various phenomena that are in our world, but they don't exist as what we are designating them as. I can say, certainly, I'm going to end here in a moment, but a bee would have a very different experience of these flowers than I would, right? If a bee were buzzing around in here and looking for pollen and what have you, it would be seeing this as like a cafeteria, or some, feeding station or whatever, right? It's not going to have that concept, that thought, but it's going to have a thought that's similar to that. Oh, that's the stuff I need to sustain my life, or, to bring back to the hive and all this stuff that they do that's part of bee behavior is going to relate to that in a very different way than putting it on a table and having the beautiful flowers around you, while they are still, maintaining their luster and what have you. So again, this is just speaking to the fact that there's no inherently existent flower out there. It can be perceived and thought of and related to in a variety of ways. It has no inherent existence. It's dependent upon sentient beings relating to it in that way. And then through the force of our own bad imprints, it appears back as if it's real in that way. And we agree to it, we assent to it. I think this is an important thing. When I first came across these teachings of Rinpoche's, I was really quite taken with this process because I think it's something that we can think about. We just instantly buy into it. But we are introduced to new phenomena all the time in our world, especially our technological world, right? Where suddenly, there's new devices and new things that we have to go, oh, wow, what's that? Oh, this is this. And then you see how the mind almost immediately, it appears that it's that from its own side now. Oh, an iPad is this. And I then grasp at it as a real iPad. It has iPadness all over its basis. And that's probably all I have time for tonight. What I would like you to do in terms of the homework, and I apologize, I realized today that I forgot to post things from last week. I will post things from this week very, very soon. So the homework that I'm going to put on the screen is just to work with on a mindfulness exercise, to work with those pride, because we haven't gone through the antidotes. So it's exercise number 1. It might not have number 1 in the final slides when I post them, but having meditated on the antidotes to pride, the 4 that are listed there, as you see any of the various types of pride arising, apply any of those we discussed to see how they diminish your pride. So work with pride for now. Begin to take a look and see if you can see the ignorance operating underneath that pride. Because as we saw, that is what pride is based on, is what we've been talking about here. This view, the transitory collection. It's looking at a real I, thinking that this exists, and then taking a pride in that, having a false sense of superiority in that. Any questions before we conclude tonight? Sorry, I've gone a little over already. Once I start talking about emptiness, it's kind of hard to stop. So, yes, Jay, please.
Okay, and I think this question is probably too huge for the end, but one of the things I find myself pondering in everything I'm listening to is the assumption the assumption of reincarnation.
Mhm.
And I recognize for me, I don't really get it. And I haven't spoken to anybody who I have heard sort of communicates that they get it in a way. So I'm wondering if you can guide me as to what I need to look at, or possibly put that on the list of questions.
And you're talking specifically about the conventional reality of reincarnation or rebirth, right? Yeah.
Is there another level?
Well, but I mean,
Sorry.
just meaning that we're just talking about what are the reasons and things that support why rebirth exists, is right? Or you're not talking about, because some people, when they get into this, when we start talking about emptiness, they start talking about like, well, who is the self that reincarnates? Which is a deeper question, perhaps a more ultimate view of what's going on in reincarnation or rebirth. Whereas, what are the things that support this happening, going from life to life? So is it the first or the
Let's go both levels, darling.
both levels? Oh,
I'm
you want to
greedy.
go for the gusto, okay. So yeah, I think I'll have to work with that in maybe next week's class, is kind of
If
address.
this is a fair question, or if you want to send me off somewhere,
Um,
you know.
there's I can say, just in terms of explaining it from a conventional point of view, we can root it in, and the Dalai Lama always roots it in the nature of mind. that if we describe, of course, it does require the premise that mind is non-material. Remember, we talked about the definition of mind earlier in this course, that which is clear and knowing. And by clear, we mean not just that it doesn't have any substantial material reality, but also that it is sort of clear, reflecting. It's like a mirror into which all the various things that we know are reflected. So if we say that that is the nature of mind and it has the function of knowing, well, then mind has to arise from something that's in the same nature. Just like if we look at our physical world, the flowers here, they have to arise from something that is in the same nature of them. There's a seed of the flower that gave rise to the flowers that are that I'm holding in this vase, right? There's always something that is the substantial cause. Many other cooperative conditions for flowers, we see that they need, sunlight and water and nutrients and what have you. In regard to sentient beings, there are other conditions too, karma and what have you, that propel them into existence after existence. But the continuity of mind means that because mind is non-material, it has to arise from something that is non-material.
Yeah.
And it has to give rise to something that is non-material. So when we get to the end of this life, where does mind go? It has to continue to give rise to moments of itself, moments of that continuity. And going back, of course, there are moments of mind that came prior to this life, moments of mind that came prior to the previous life, and so on. There is a continuity of mental moments that are and this is, again, they call it a proof of past lives and future lives. Many people might not see it as an absolute proof, but it gives us the foundation for understanding why that occurs. Because mind can't be destroyed. It never stops giving rise to something that's in its continuity, continuum, nor can it come from nowhere. So it has to have come from prior moments of mind. It has to give rise to subsequent moments of mind. Therefore, it's outside the realm of just what materialists would see as this life being the beginning of consciousness and the end of consciousness, when we are born and when we die, or even sometime in the womb, they would say, scientists. So again, this is the rationale for explaining why rebirth occurs. Now we'll go into the second part of the question of well, what is it that really takes rebirth? And, is there some sort of constant self in all of this? I think we can answer that already from the teachings tonight, but we'll get into that a little bit. So,
Fabulous. Thank you. That's
okay.
helpful.
All right.
Appreciate that. Take
I think
care.
okay, thanks. I think we're going to have to
Bye-bye.
probably end tonight. I don't want to keep people here too late. We did start a little late with the technical issues, but nonetheless, I'm always going over. I think that might be what's on my tombstone when I die. He always went a few minutes over, at least. Maybe my life will go a few minutes over my death. We'll see if I can make that happen. If you have questions, please write them down. And at the beginning of next week, remind me to take questions and to answer Jay's question. I'll make note of it myself. Well, let me do the prayers. Let's do the prayers. And then those of you, I will post the homework out there. If you want to just read the homework later, you can go do that. Those of you who want to hang out in the Zoom room a little longer or here in the Gompo, I will go into the homework and that, and it's very brief, but I'll just go back to the slides. Let's do these dedication prayers together. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. And tonight, let's just do the prayer for His Holiness. And as we recite this, think that we're creating the causes for him, as well as all of our spiritual guides, to have good health and long lives, and all their wishes to be fulfilled immediately. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then I hate leaving off the prayer for Rinpoche's swift return, but let's, in our heart, make very strong dedications for Rinpoche to return quickly, so we and others in this world can benefit from his presence once more. Then let's dedicate also for the beings we're holding in our hearts, whoever it is that moves us at this time, those we know, as well as those that we don't know, who are going through difficulties such as illness, obstacles, dying, or who have died recently. send this positive energy out to those beings so they can experience the benefit of those, having their suffering removed and having all the causes ripen for them to be able to find true peace and happiness. And may all beings have these results through what we've done here together tonight. So again, just briefly, those of you who do want to just stay for a second, after the mindfulness exercise, the reading assignment is to take a look at that if you wish to, part 2 that talks about this false appearance, taking those things as true, because it's not just happening with regard to the flowers of the eye, it's happening in regard to everything. And it's good to have some kind of reading on that. Then part 4, how the section we've been mainly working with, how the disturbing emotions arise. Go ahead and review ignorance. Take a look, even if you can, at deluded doubt. Hopefully we'll get to some of that next time, as well as even a few more of the afflicted views. Those 3 that are all kind of involved in distorted ways of looking at things. They're all sort of rooted in some form of ignorance. And then the 20 close afflictions. There are 6. Remember, there are these close afflictions, particularly the 3 root poisons. So there are 6 close afflictions that are derived from confusion. I'll try to get to those as well, because again, it is important to understand how ignorance also manifests in some other ways that are not these major forms of ignorance that we're working with, but lead to some confusion in our lives. So, all right, thank you all for tuning in tonight and being here in Nagompa as well. Appreciate all of it. You being here and partaking of this class. We've got 4 more sessions left in February, so we'll try to get through what we can. But again, I just hope that what I'm doing for you allows you to have some tools to work with in working with your mind. So if you can do that during time between classes, that's great. Thanks so much. Be well. See you soon.